So let's dive a little bit deeper into how functions handle things behind the scenes. So when you define a function, right? Let's say I define square function, calculates the result, and then returns the result. Later in the program, I expect an input from the user. Input a number, right? Then let's just change this input into a number since it's a string at this point. Let's call it, and then we go ahead and call this function square of x int. Okay? Now, what this will do is when we call the function and give it some input, right? This is called argument. Passing argument to the function. All right? This argument is passed to the parameter. This is parameter. So what happens is the value of this x. So what is this? In our memory, let's suppose this is RAM. And as we have studied, when you define a variable x int, it is a pointer to the location in memory which holds the value of this number. So if the number is 2, for example, this value will be stored in RAM. However, when we call this function and pass in the value x int as an argument, it will go ahead and create another variable input somewhere else in the RAM, okay, and copy the value to there. All right. So now this variable input defined in the parameter is pointing to a value 2 somewhere in memory, and x int is another variable which is pointing to the value 2 somewhere else in memory. So we have 2 copies of this value. All right. This is called pass by value, because we are passing the value of this variable to the parameter. Okay, so that's called pass by value. Whatever operation we do on this input, right, we multiply this input by itself and store the result. So the result will be another variable which holds the value 4 in our case. Now this value right here, result and input variable, are local to the function. And in our previous lectures, we have studied 2 different types of variables. One is local, one is global. These 2 variables are local to the function. So whenever the function executes and sends its response back to the caller, this variable will cease to exist, and this variable also will no longer be available. So when the function executes, returns the value, this value is gone and this location is gone, because these are local variables. However, the caller of the function right here still has a value x int. So if you print x int here, it will still be available. However, if you see here, we are not doing anything with the return value. Okay, so it will be lost. Even though the value is returned to the client is not making use of it. It's not storing it anywhere, or it's not printing it or anything else. So this value will be lost. In order to retain this value, what we would do is we can say another variable, squared value, let's say a variable name, and when we call the function square, passing it x int, it will square this number, and the result is stored in the squared value variable. So somewhere in RAM, it will create another variable, squared value, and store the result for here. Now you can, later on in your program, let's say if you want to print the result, you can just simply call that variable squared value, and it will know what the result is, and it will be able to use that result in your print statement. That's how you retain the return value from a function. Now there are also functions which do not take any input parameter, right? In that case, their input is actually void, right? So for example, if I have a function which just displays a message to the user, I will just have an empty parentheses with no parameters defined. And over here, I can just print the message, right? Whatever message I have, let's just say hello, okay? Now in this case, printing hello does not require any input because we already know the greeting message. Also, it's not returning any value, so its return also is void. So keep in mind that this is also possible in a programming language, that a function may not have any input or it may not have any return value. If you want to send a greeting to a person, right, whose name we input from somewhere else. So in this case, we have to tell the display function the input value or the name of the person so that it can greet that person. So some functions, so if I have a variable name, Mo for example, I need to pass this name to this display function in a parameter. Okay, so I can call this variable name input, for example, and then I can use this input and say hello name input. All right, so this is an example of a function which takes in one parameter, but it still does not return anything to the user back. Now there may be other functions, for example, which require more than one parameter. Considering the same display function, let's suppose we have first name and last name is. When we call this function, we have to pass in both the information, right? So we can call it first name, parameter name, and last name as two parameters. And then in our greeting message, we can use these parameters to display the message. So we can say, so this is an example of a function which takes multiple values, all right? In order to call this function, all we do is we say display, and we pass in these two values, which are our variables, f name and L name, and its value will be passed over here, displayed in the message, and the function returns nothing. So we don't need to store any return value, especially in this case.